Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dan Smith, Director of SIPRI.
Hello, everybody. You are watching the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development on the theme in 2021 of promoting peace in the age of compound risk. Welcome to this afternoon session. Our first panel is on preventing famine, promoting peace. The background to this is that famine is back on the agenda. 30 million people live on the edge of famine at the moment. And of course, as always, the famine issue is closely connected to violent conflict. Take one step further back for more background, and the issue is that hunger has been rising worldwide over the past 4 or 5 years, after a period of 2.5 decades when the situation was steadily improving. So we can see that conflict drives hunger, and hunger drives conflict. The two-way link is well established. And it was recognized with a UN Security Council resolution in 2018. Resolution 2417 is the number. It condemns starvation and it recognizes that link between conflict and hunger. We can summarize it like this. Food security is foundational for peace, and peace is foundational for food security. That's what we're here to discuss this afternoon, and we want to know, why is famine back on the agenda? How much of this issue is structural and needs a long-term approach? And what are the practical steps that can be taken to move us forward on these tough and troubling issues? And to discuss them, we have a really great panel. I think that the discussion is going to be full of insight and diverse perspectives. Before we get to the panel, I just want to remind you that you can ask questions via the box on the right-hand side of your screen if you're using our conference platform. Or if you're following on the live stream, you can tweet to at SIPRI.org using the hashtag #STHLMForum. First, because he couldn't be with us to join us this afternoon in the panel, we have a video message from David Beasley, the Executive Director of the World Food Programme. So let's start with that.
Thank you for inviting me to contribute to this very important conversation today. The title of the session, Preventing Famine, Promoting Peace. This highlights an important truth. Conflict drives hunger and famine, and hunger and famine drives conflict. When you do as we do on a daily basis, feeding 100 and 115 million people, you learn this firsthand. I've witnessed this devastating impact of vicious cycles for myself time after time. And on a recent visit just to Yemen, the DRC, South Sudan, I've met families and children who are starving because they are caught in the crossfire of conflict. The link between hunger and conflict is beyond doubt. The question is, how do we break it once and for all? And to succeed, we need a clear plan of action. And that starts with recognizing that starvation and famine are man-made. Instability and conflict combine with economic crisis to destroy the systems which produce, manage, and distribute food to civilian populations. The result is widespread hunger, malnutrition, and in the worst cases, famine, starvation, death. To change this tragic and predictable outcome, we need to take a three-pronged approach. First, we need concerted political action by the international community to end the rising number of conflicts around the world. The United Nations Security Council's decision to pass Resolution 2417 is an important step towards seeking political solutions. But now the international community needs to live up to the values it enshrines. Number two, second, we have to make the right investments at the right time. In the short term, $5.5 billion is urgently needed to stave off famine in multiple countries. That's not the total financial picture. That's just for the 34 million people out of the 270 million that are marching towards starvation that are already knocking on famine's door. One step away from starvation and death. The world has to act now. Longer term, we must also invest, of course, in health, education, sustainable livelihood programs, which are the best way to offer vulnerable communities the chance to build resilience and stand on their own 2 feet. This is critical to help lay the foundations to build greater stability and peace around the world. And third, we need to work with governments to strengthen national frameworks to ensure that all communities, no matter who they are or where they live, have equal access to nutritious foods. This is fundamental to reduce social tensions and to build peace. I recognize this is a hugely ambitious agenda, but I'm optimistic that if we invest wisely, work in partnership, work together, we can help vulnerable communities find a pathway out of poverty and hunger, toward stability and peace. So please, let's commit today to do this on behalf of all the people we all serve, doing it together.
So thank you very much to David Beasley, the Executive Director of the World Food Programme, for that message. An ambitious agenda, as he said, about which we need a plan, about which we need a practical approach. And for discussing this whole set of issues, we've got here in the studio and connecting virtually, as is the way today, I'm afraid, a tremendous panel. Let me introduce them all to you first, beginning with Janine Ericson, the State Secretary for International Development here in Sweden. A real pleasure to have you here, Janine. Joining us from somewhere is Valerie Guarnieri, who is the Assistant Executive Director of the World Food Programme. We have Agnes Kalibata, who is the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for a particularly important event, which is happening this year, the first Food Systems Summit in the UN, that will be happening in September of this year. Also with us, Gabriela Bucher, who is the Executive Director of Oxfam, and Muna Luqman, who is a founder and chairperson of Food for Humanity, which is and co-founder of the Women's Solidarity Network, which is the largest women's network in Yemen, and will be talking to us about that experience later on. But Janine, I want to begin with you, if I can, and I want to begin with that small question which I posed right at the beginning. Why is famine back on our agenda? Why are we having to deal with this issue still?
Well, that is a very good but also very tragic question, of course. And thank you for inviting me to be here and talk about this very important topic today. And we saw, even before the pandemic, that starvation was going up and more people were in a very bad state, according to famine and starvation. And I see that with this situation with the pandemic, it has of course not improved. And the answer to the pandemic and all the causes must be a very joint response, and we cannot do it without cooperation. So that is one of my key issues too, that we have to come together in the world to solve this. Pandemic has showed us that we have to work more together, and this is also an opportunity where we can end famine and really do things about it. We see that a building back better and greener agenda is crucial to also have all the Agenda 2030 goals in closer reach, even if it now has been very much further away to reach them. But it is still a roadmap that we need to use. And in the agenda, we state with goal 2, with ending hunger, and also 16 with peaceful societies. It's very important to tie these two together. And as both you and David Beasley stated out very clearly, this is a relationship that needs to be dealt with very much more than we have done so far. Because armed conflict is the primary driver for hunger today. I think even if the pandemic has strengthened that bond, I think we can just realize that. But also that conflict resolution is the key, one of the very most important keys to end famine. And we talked about COVID, but of course also extreme weather due to climate change, lack of biodiversity, and other issues is of course also important to have a whole part of this. And another thing that is, of course, very important is the lack of humanitarian access. And there we can state that what is really needed here, in all the points, in all the goals in the agenda, is a political will. because it is awful that we are now sitting in a situation where so many people are starving, and we will probably have more to come. And there are politicians and decision makers that can make these decisions and make it easier for people to get access to food and food security. And I think that is one of the main issues too, that we have to have politicians that are brave and actually dare to take the decisions that are needed. Because, and there are the 3 points, like prevention. We need to see where conflict is rising before it breaks out in order to make a sustainable peace and before conflict, because after it is much more difficult. And we also have to hold accountable so that in starting conflict, you should know that this is not something that you can get out of without anything happening after. And the world, David Beasley mentioned the UN system, and here we have to be clear from the whole multinational society, I think. And promote peace by preventing famine. I mean, the word for this seminar is, of course, very important, because when people are hungry, when they cannot feed their children, they go out in the streets and you create insecurity, instability, and conflict. And of course, we also have to see how we get the aid to the people. And I know that you have research on that area, and I hope I will hear more about that. And the last thing is the financial gap, that we have so much more need in the world today than there is money. And that is also why long-term sustainable funding to the UN system, amongst other things, is a very important and a very important for Sweden.
I mean, I think that one of the things that we're going to be picking up on a lot during this conversation is surfaced in what you were saying. On the one hand, there's the question of humanitarian access. There's the emergency. There's getting the supplies through to the people who need it and who will die otherwise. And then there are the more structural questions. And that's to do with longer term development and peace building. Do you think it is possible to keep these agendas apart, or do you see them coming more and more together, and how?
I see that they have to come more together, because otherwise we cannot work in the silos that we have been doing for such a long time. We have to see that these are interconnected problems, and we have to solve them together. And I also see that there are signs that all organizations, civil society and the UN system are working in this direction to actually get more impact, to have the humanitarian and the sustainable development agenda tied together. And I think that is what the Agenda 2030 also tells us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Valerie Guarnieri, if I can move on to you, and we've heard from the head of your organization, David Beasley, in his kind of, let me say, usual inspirational form, really tying these questions closely together. So world hunger was on the increase, as Janine has pointed out, as we have been pointing out already, before the pandemic. Is it a sign that we're actually seeing a systemic breakdown? I mean, is that part of what the background is to the return of famine to the agenda, to the problems that we see today?
Well, Dan, thank you for having it, and thank you and the Swedish ministry for this meeting. And when WFP was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize last year, we were so humbled and honored by the recognition that it gave to our staff and our partners working in conflict zones around the world. But we also see it as an opportunity and a responsibility to be looking at addressing and breaking that hunger conflict link that we're talking about here today, and its most deadly manifestation in famine. And discussions like this really give us the opportunity to galvanize the kind of attention and support for action in order to reach those furthest behind. And my executive director, David Beasley, highlighted the importance of political action to resolve conflicts, making the right investments at the right time, and strengthening national and subnational systems to deliver food and nutrition for all. So yes, it is, we're seeing famines back on the agenda due to both proximate problems that are here, but also systemic breakdowns. And we need to be addressing at both of those levels simultaneously. So you highlighted at the beginning, Dan, that we had a relatively stable level of acute hunger until 2019, and then we saw it rising. But in the past year, with we were already facing hunger because of conflict, because of climate, because of economic disparities. But the COVID really came in as a risk multiplier, and as such, we have catapulted the hunger issue into greater dimensions. So 270 million people facing acute hunger, 4 countries at the risk of famine, 34 million marching towards famine, as David Beasley highlighted. And famines aren't new to any of us. They're not new to the World Food Program either. We came of age in the 60s with Biafra. We were involved in famine responses in the Sahel in the 70s, Ethiopia in 1984, Somalia 91, 92, 2011 again, South Sudan in 2017. And my first experience was in Somalia in 1992, and the devastation that you see, the suffering that exists, the human suffering that comes with the famine, it's something that you can't unsee. But it's also a very silent situation. It's when famine is unfolding, there's a deathly quiet that sets in, and it is up to us to be raising our voices and making those calls before a famine is declared, because once it is declared, it's too late. So our lifetime of it stays with the people who are affected for a lifetime, and also intergenerationally. But we know that while famine can be triggered by climate, by a drought, by a flood, or by a cholera outbreak, at its root is conflict, and conflict that is man-made failure, man-made failure to employ systems that help ensure support to those furthest behind, and around that is the access restrictions, the governance failures, the displacement that occurs in the context, and all of this leads to that extreme situation of famine. And so yes, we're seeing these things evolve, and far too frequently. We have some opportunities for change, but that really requires that we break some of the bad patterns. We have a real opportunity with UN Security Council Resolution 2417, unanimously adopted, but 3 years later, we're still seeing hunger being used as a weapon of war. And we saw that, just last year in South Sudan, for instance, where infrastructure and means of production were deliberately destroyed to punish communities who weren't aligned to a militia agenda. We also need to break the pattern of responding too late. By the time famine is declared, it is too late. And we know investments in linking early warning to early action can help prevent famine. We have the warning signs. We need to follow those up with a large-scale response, and we've seen the result. When we do that, as was done in Somalia in 2017, we are able to prevent a famine. And then, third, really bringing together those partnerships to ensure simultaneous investments in system support to national and subnational systems, making sure they're efficient, they're effective, they're delivering food and nutrition support, both food systems and social protection systems, reaching those furthest behind. So these are some of the opportunities for change that are there. Will we take advantage of them before they're too late? That's the question.
Well, that's the question I think that we are also hoping to help answer by having an event like this, bringing so many different people together from around the planet. And thank you very much for not only speaking so vividly, and if I may say, but in a good sense, painfully, about the famines, also for speaking about the opportunities for action. And I think we will come back to that and discuss that some more. But I want to move on now, if I may, to Agnes Kalibata, the Special Envoy for the Food Systems Summit. And ask you, Agnes, to kind of link together. We're hearing about, as Valerie put it, the proximate causes and then the more structural causes. You're leading the work on the Food Systems Summit. Do you think that something that one could call a food systems approach can help in the approach to famine? And how would that look like?
Thank you for that question, Dan. Listen, the challenges of the food systems, that is leading to increasing famine have been talked about by so many people. Yesterday were discussed in detail. And again, the three areas that keep coming back: conflict, the issue of economic shocks like COVID, but also the challenge around weather and climate change, if you might say. Those are some of the critical underlying factors that were mentioned. Now, when the Food Systems Summit was launched, it was recognizing that we have an opportunity by working through the food system, an area that touches all 17 SDGs, that we have an opportunity to come through, to find solutions within the system and be able to come through. And there's a reason why the food within the SDGs, dealing with poverty is number one. If you remember, reducing poverty is SDG 1. And yesterday, as we were having conversations, and which I completely believe that if the issue of dealing with poverty and inequity is the root cause of why we are having these conflicts, and is the Food Systems Summit offers an opportunity for us to discuss these challenges. Why aren't we able to come through on SDGs? We are, in many of these cases, we are reversing, we are moving forward, backwards as opposed to moving forwards. We have 10 years to come through, as the Secretary General has said. So what we did is we've designed a machinery, I would call it the Food Systems Summit machinery, that is about ensuring that everybody's engaged. I think David Beasley talked about it. Ensuring that because this is about people, ensuring that people understand what is at stake, but also understanding our place and role in ending conflict, in ensuring peace, in resolving all these challenges that we have. So really, the summit is designed as something that is a people's summit and giving people a chance and an opportunity to act, but also to hold each other accountable. So that's number one. Number two is to look at the possible solution that can help us within the food system that can help us deal with this challenge. And those solutions are being studied, and we hope that by the time of the Food System Summit, we will be able to come up with a number of recommendations. Again, for me, these recommendations have to be dealing with the core challenges that underlie conflict, which is causing 70% of the famine that we are seeing. So coming up to the summit, we hope that there's going to be another element that is very critical, leaders stepping forward. We're talking about Resolution 2417, we're talking about SDGs, but at the core of this is the fact that we have an opportunity, let me put it positively, we have an opportunity to come through for people. We have an opportunity to come through for planet. We won't be able to do it if leaders don't step forward and say no to what we need to be saying no to, and really invest in areas where we need to be investing, but also find an opportunity to build coalitions and build partnerships that can help us come through in the same spirit of SDG 17, which was really put there to help us understand that none of us can deliver on any of these things alone. We have an opportunity, and part of what we are doing in the Food Systems Summit is to look at the type of coalitions that will bring us together against some of the areas we need to deliver against. We want to make sure that women and youth, the people that suffer the most when it comes to hunger. Yesterday we were talking about nearly 100 million kids that are stunted under 5, that are wasted under 5. These are the people we need to be bringing, women that go through this with their children, youth that have their future ahead of them. We need to help them understand the place that they play in our food system, but also the solutions that are there and the ability to hold all of us accountable. So for me, increasing famine is not something that is not solvable. It is a solvable challenge. The question is, are we up to it? Are we prepared to do this for people, for us, for our planet? Because every time we don't solve the challenge of poverty, it puts so much pressure on our planet because it's putting so much pressure on people. So we can't solve one problem and not solve the other. We have interconnected challenges, and the Food Systems Summit is about how we solve these interconnected challenges. And for me, addressing the issue of poverty and inequity is at the bottom of these conflicts, and we must address it within the Food Systems Summit.
Well, I want to thank you, especially Agnes, for putting SDG 17. I think it's often the forgotten SDG onto the map. It's not the one which gives you the target of no more hunger or ending poverty. It's the one which says how to work on it. And it is to work in partnership and cooperation. I think that's fundamental. I wanted to go straight from the point you made at the end there onto my question for Gabriela, because you ended on talking about inequities. And Gabriela, I want to turn to you and ask you the degree to which we can see famine and more broadly the increase in hunger as being linked to, I suppose you could call them persistent structural inequities in food systems. Because if they are there, then just as we cannot make progress on food security without making progress on peace, we also cannot make progress on food security without making progress on more equal and fair societies.
Yes, thank you, Dan. I think starvation and hunger, absolutely, yes, they're symptoms of a profoundly systemic failure that is rooted in inequality. Inequality in power, inequality in income and wealth, inequality between women and men. And we have to connect these issues. Inequality fuels hunger and often conflict and hunger drive deeper inequality. So it's a repetitive cycle of human misery. And my predecessors on the panel have said it's very much a man-made problem. So these are problems we can solve. We can pursue peace so that farmers aren't forced from their lands or watch their crops destroyed in war. We can start rebuilding a more equal future where women are truly included in our economies, where we invest more in small-scale agriculture. So our challenge is not that we don't know how to address hunger, it's that we lack the political will to do so. The vested interests of wealthy nations and huge corporations are blocking the systemic changes that we need to make to ensure that all people have enough food on their plate. So the UN Secretary General called for a global ceasefire, as David Beasley was mentioning, to challenge the COVID-19 situation. But over a year later, we haven't seen any sustained action toward it. Indeed, many of the same member states who endorsed this call continue to sell arms to countries at war. Humanitarians continue to be denied access in conflict areas as warring parties leverage starvation for military gain. So using hunger as a weapon of war is an atrocity. And Oxfam was formed 80 years ago in response to the blockade of Greece. And yet we will see in 2021 blockages cutting off food supplies to civilians. We live in a world in which those most powerful countries find it easier to deliver guns to war zones than they do food. And this is systemic failure. So for me, action starts here. First is to hold accountable those who use starvation as a weapon of armed conflict. It is to urgently fund the UN Secretary General's global appeal for 5.5 billion to meet additional needs to avert famine. And this is urgent. In the global report on food crisis released yesterday, 142 million people are forecast to be in acute food and livelihood crisis this year, a 56% increase since 2016, 56%. So it really pains me and it angers me, and it was unavoidable, and the warnings were there. But secondly, we need to step back and just as urgently address the food system here. Let me put that the 5.5 billion call for aid in perspective. Last year, as COVID struck and millions went hungry, 8 of the largest food and beverage companies paid out over 18 billion to their shareholders. So we live in a world so unequal that even the people who grow our food don't earn enough to feed themselves. More than 1.7 billion people in the food industry are unable to produce enough food or earn enough income to escape hunger and poverty. And women are typically the hardest hit. We can do so much more to ensure that farmers get a fair price for their goods. We can eliminate unfair trading practices and guarantee the freedom of workers to organize. These measures would transform millions of lives. It is fundamental about shifting inequalities at the heart of our food system, away from big corporations and towards ordinary farmers, and especially women farmers. That's my third point. We have to address that this unjust system is built on the backs of women. In peace and in conflict, the impact is most severe on women. Women like Rani, who we work with, who picks tea on a plantation in Assam, India. She and many plantation workers are systematically denied a minimum living wage. Women have the heaviest burden as they're concentrated in the lowest paid plucking roles while they continue their unpaid care work in domestic settings. The world would look like if we were able to reduce such inequality. Well, the FAO estimates that if women had the same access to resources as men, they could increase yields on their farms by up to 30%, reducing the number of hungry people in the world by nearly 1 in 5. I conclude by saying there isn't a lack of food, there is a lack of equality. And with a mission to pursue equality, to truly pursue peace, with the political will, we have it in our means to end hunger.
Gabriela, can you just follow up briefly, if at all possible, with any examples that come to mind about where these structural inequalities have been broken down? I mean, even in kind of quite local circumstances, are there some things that we can take and say, well, it worked there, it's worth trying somewhere else, it may be if scaled up and so on?
I think one key element of this, I've said about the living wage. So it's the living wage for direct workers in the large food companies, but also the whole supply chain. So those farmers who are producing for all of us to consume food are not being rewarded in ways that allow them to access basic food for themselves. So that would be a structural change that would transform if it were carried out systematically, and that is in the purview of companies to decide, and some are leading in that respect already.
Thank you.
As an example.
Thank you so much. Let me turn to Muna Luqman now. Muna, Yemeni human rights activist and first-hand experience of some of the issues that we're talking about. Yemen facing a really terrible famine, part of a broader humanitarian crisis that obviously includes war, and it includes the cholera epidemic and now maybe the effects of the COVID pandemic. What do you think are the first steps that the country needs or that are needed to move towards the change that's necessary in Yemen?
Well, thank you, Dan. First of all, the most imperative humanitarian step in Yemen is ending the devastating war without delay and terminating the land, sea, air imposed by the Saudi coalition, and ending the violence on the ground imposed by the Houthi militant group, restoring the state institutions through a comprehensive and inclusive peace process and security sector reform. We have to speak, Dan, really hard truths when it's starvation in Yemen. The lack of accountability, diversion and corruption of aid. Every day or every year we hear billions of dollars provided by donor countries, but we don't really see a significant impact on people's lives. And I appreciate all the work of international organizations in Yemen, but we are really seeing, we are reaching a point where even the operational costs are even higher than the actual aid delivered, and we need to have a restructure of the humanitarian aid response plan in Yemen. That's why I think that youth activists are initiating campaigns demanding more transparency, because they've seen so much diversion and obstruction of aid. And that's one cause. But that's, of course, not the only cause. We have the local currency, which collapsed, the whole economy that's collapsed, pushing food and essential goods, nearly all of which are imported, out of reach. Fuel prices are surging, high transportation costs. So as the deadly conflict persists, we're seeing millions of innocent people being internalized, and we're particularly concerned about Marib, where there has been more than nearly 2 million displaced people there under attack as we speak. there's an escalation of fighting there. So the humanitarian efforts in Yemen need to be funded, continued. Cutting aid is not the solution, but we do need a more comprehensive response to aid in Yemen. We also need to focus more on sustainable impact, and you mentioned this, Dan, and our colleagues mentioned this many times, that livelihoods, equality programs, agriculture, fisheries, electricity and water services, combating recruitment of children, all of these have been flagged by our members of our network and by people as priorities, because they are also leading to more violence. We also need a gender audit of ongoing future relief operations. And to be practical, no amount of aid can offset the economic gaps, spiking food prices and war economy in Yemen. The only sustainable approach for Yemen is actually ending the war and bringing a more peaceful and stability into Yemen. So I will end there and be open to more later on.
Yes, I mean, I think it's so clear in the case of Yemen, but I think you can extend from that to other cases. If the war continues, it is not possible to address the longer term questions. War, of course, is a fundamentally political issue, and the hard truths which you are talking about are that in order to solve what they saw as a security and a political problem, Saudi Arabia launched an intervention into Yemen, which has only made the situation there tragic. And Saudi Arabia and its allies are not the only actors who have been causing problems, far from it, in Yemen. You mentioned the Houthis on the ground as well. But that escalation of the violence underlies the tragedy that we face today. Now, I think that what we're hearing, Janine, I want to come back to you and start a second round of questions which are less prepared questions, less pre-formulated. So bear with me a second. It seems to me as if we're talking about a kind of a triangle made up of massive pillars of conflict, of the impact of climate change, though it hasn't been much talked about, but it's there very, very strongly, and of social inequalities, injustice, unfairness, and the political power that derives from that. And in the middle of this triangle with these huge pillars sits the food question. Hunger or famine, or indeed successful and sustainable food systems. From a government minister's, from a state secretary's point of view, from the view from within the foreign ministry, where is the best starting point here? Is it somehow a comprehensive approach? And if so, what does that look like? Or is it targeted towards one or other of the pillars? And if so, what does that look like?
No, I think we have to work with all those issues at the same time, because we cannot deal with just one and leave the others to later, because they are so interlinked, and we really need to deal with this in a joint way. And that is also what I said before with the Agenda 2030. It shows us that this is the way to move forward. We have to do it together, and we have to do it like all at the same time. But as we see, if there's war and conflict, none of the other goals can be reached. We will have famine, we will have starvation, we will not have equality, and we will continue to have this really bad and cynical situation. Because what it boils down to is politicians and decision makers that has to really see that, because there's research there. We know what needs to be done. We know the humanitarian, we know the long term and the development and the climate and the biodiversity and everything. But we do not deal with it because there are other interests among many decision makers that really comes before. And that is really the driving force in this. And
so I want to take a lap around all the panel and come back and ask you about the question of accountability. And, Valerie, as you look at these issues from inside the WFP, I mean, we've been working together for some time now. CIPRI has a partnership with the World Food Programme, which we're very pleased with, and we're learning a huge amount from, and hope you're learning some too. And one of the things which we know about is the kind of the conflicting pressures and opinions and preferences inside the World Food Programme, and there are within other big agencies as well, and within the donor governments, about keeping the humanitarian function clear, maintaining the humanitarian space in which you can operate to get the access, and yet at the same time dealing with this intersection of the humanitarian tragedy with the three pillars that I was mentioning. Where are things sitting now in WFP as you consider this strategic question?
Well, thanks, Dan. And I mean, we are learning so much and continue to learn from the engagement and the partnership that we have with CIFPRI. And I mean, indeed, these tensions are there and they're natural. We know, and we're really embedding in our new strategic plan that we're working on, that as an organization, we need to be working on the shocks and the manifestation of the shocks on people. And at the same time, working on those stressors and the structural vulnerabilities. So we need to be bringing our capabilities, our assets, our knowledge to the table and be addressing all of these areas at the same time. But of course, we also realize that it's not just about us, and it's not even just about the humanitarian or the humanitarian and development system. At the root of a lot of these issues is weak governance and difficulties, undercapacitated and under-resourced systems. But also individuals who are going to be at the heart of any change, but who don't have the agency to really be deploying their own solutions. And so, I think when we look at this, we recognize that we need to bring a people-centered approach, and really the needs, the aspirations, and the vulnerabilities of people needs to be at the center of action. And we need to recognize that we're coming to the table as humanitarian, as development players, and as peace actors with, different skills, different advantages, different capacities, sometimes even a different language. We bring a humanitarian perspective at WFP that can be unnecessarily short-term, and we need to be bringing longer-term solutions to these recurring challenges and shocks and deep-rooted shocks. But development actors coming into these contexts also tend to be risk-adverse, are a little slow with the financing and with the action, and don't necessarily target those areas or those people that are furthest behind. So bringing that all together on the ground requires that we speak the same language and build these productive partnerships. And so it does come down to partnerships within the humanitarian community, among the humanitarian development and peace community and actors, and with nations at the national level, but also at the subnational level or even at the community level.
And if you and fellow peace builders like me will forgive me for saying this, if you can think of the humanitarian community as maybe sometimes taking a short-term view, and the development community as sometimes being, unfortunately, a bit risk-averse, the peace-building community finds it somewhat difficult sometimes to describe impact. So there is something that we can all learn from each other about this. Both from our working methods as well as from thinking about the main problems that we're addressing in the intersection. Agnes, I wanted to ask you, you've spoken very strongly and clearly, and I've heard you before, talk about that interrelationship between the conflict questions, conflict and peace on the one hand, food insecurity and security on the other. And to what extent do you think it will be possible to address those questions and those intersections in the Food Systems Summit, in the process towards it, at the summit itself perhaps, and thereafter?
Thank you. One of the things that has emerged as we talk about conflict as it relates to the Food Systems Summit, we've had basically a temptation to say, well, this is something that seems to be going beyond the food systems. But like I said before, we need to analyze the root causes of conflict and therefore famine, and to try to ask ourselves how that is rooted in food systems. And I will just give you 2 examples. 30% of the famine increases in famine we are seeing are coming from weather-related shocks and economic shocks. If you call COVID-19 one of the economic shocks, that is actually environmental and food-related, in the sense that it's a zoonotic disease that is coming from encroachment on the environment, it's definitely food systems related. If you look at how climate change goes on at least in my part of the world on the equator, how this is completely undermining the ability of people to have sufficient food, and how you all have talked about the fact that conflict undermines food security and food security leads to conflict, vice versa. It's a vicious cycle. So the food system is really at the center of all those. We can't get conflict that is causing famine and have it outside there. We need to take advantage of the challenges within the food system that can help us start addressing some of those challenges that we see. So again, let's go back to the key elements of the SDGs. Let's address hunger. Let's address poverty. And you've said it, Dan. Are we really going to address the right level of investment so that we can start dealing with the question of poverty in different places? Are we going to take advantage of the 9 seasons that are remaining between now and 2030 and ensure that producing food is something that is addressing the challenge of equity and better livelihoods for people? So that's what the food system is about. We have 5 action tracks in the food system, and all those action tracks are trying to address challenges that touch people directly, challenges that touch our environment directly, and challenges that touch the quality of life that we lead. And I believe that if we address these from a food systems perspective, we will address 90% of the problems that could cause conflict, and then whatever else happens can be resolved and addressed through other resolutions and other opportunities through COP26, through all the other things that are happening in addition to the food system.
So thank you so much. I want to say quickly to the audience watching us that if you want to ask questions, please remember you can tweet them to at CIPRI.org using the hashtag STHLM, which is short for Stockholm, STHLM Forum. And you can also use the box on the right-hand side of your screen. They come through to me on the iPad, and I will feed them into the conversation as we go. Gabriela, I wanted to ask you to go a little bit more, if you would, into the gendered dimension to famine and hunger, and what you already started talking about. I think if there's something to add about the gendered dimension to taking the opportunities moving forward.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think also in terms of the accountability, I think we should focus on that, the farmer, the woman farmer, on which so much of the system is built. And to her, we need to be accountable, and to her, we need to eliminate all the barriers and respect what she does. Because in reality, she not only has the barriers that we said if we unleash them, they would actually be transformative for the whole system, but also she has the deepest consequences on her own health because of the gender norms and inequities. Women tend to come last in terms of meals, and with women also girls. And what happens in terms of the effects on their health for themselves and the next generation compounds the issue of the effects that are so long-standing. So it's how to address in the short term so that we can unleash the power of women farmers to be in the food system, contributing and also benefiting.
So thank you so much. And I want to now take a question which has come from the audience through, as I said, onto my iPad. And Mona, I'm going to direct it towards you. Part of the question is a general one. It's how can NGOs and smaller states advocate, and what else can they do to improve humanitarian access? But the second part of it says, e.g. in Yemen, where many big states are involved. Is there something that you can say to those, to the NGOs, to the powers, or the potential external actors who are not at the moment engaged in any kind of destructive action in Yemen? What are the possibilities? What can NGOs and other governments do that would want to help? What can they do?
Thank you for the question. I would say that I think partnering with local grassroots initiatives and organizations is key. And we have been hearing it's a man-made crisis all over the world. And I think now we need a women-led solution. Also, bring the women in the front lines, because they already are in the front lines, but they're not in the front lines of getting the funding that they need. They have the entry points, they have access. I'm not saying that they can do this on their own. We need to go back to the partnership pillar, and that's so important. But we really need to start thinking of efficiency and ensuring access through the locals. And I also want to emphasize the importance of youth-led organizations who are really at the front lines. I think there are NGOs around the world, donors who can support, need to focus on the majority of the aid funding with sustainable impact. And I think that focusing through or working with women-led organizations and youth-led organizations, local actors on the ground, the private sector and public sector, all together, and trying to support them, providing more flexible multi-year funding would really be efficient and will have more impact. And we've seen this during COVID-19. We've seen how the response was efficient, timely, and it was collaborated at the right time, and really prevented a lot of loss. So I think that would be my advice.
I mean, I think that's incredibly helpful, because sometimes when we're talking about partnership, it's important, but it's very abstract. It's international partnership, it's international cooperation, it's government to government, you think UN, or it's, like the partnership that Valerie and I were talking about between CIPRI and WFP. But you're talking about partnerships with organizations on the ground, with youth organizations, with people, with communities, talking about people working together, small organizations working together. And I think that's a very helpful tip, I think, to be giving to understand the need, the importance of breaking down the concept of partnership into really pragmatic, realistic, practical steps. Janine, now I want to come to you and ask you the accountability question. How do we manage to hold those actors who are doing, who are indeed leveraging starvation for conflict gain? How do we manage to hold them to account, whether they're governments or non-state actors? What can be done? What's the framework?
Well, that is the question that we all seek the answer to, I think, because if we find that, we will also be able to put more pressure and really make sure that those that are responsible also take that responsibility, and that if they don't, they can be accountable. But as you said, when we discuss on this level, we're on the very big level, but I think we always have to remember that what happens on the ground and the local in the local settings, it's different all the time. But I think it's very important that we, from the international community and everything, in if it's multilateral or bilateral, that we have to be very clear that human rights is crucial, and that this has to be followed by everyone all the time, and then that there's no escape from this. But that voice is not so clear. Even if we have the Security Council, we have the Secretary General, who is very clear and try to push this agenda, we still see that it's not, the whole community is not talking with one voice in this.
We've got an institutional framework there, and we have considerable part of a legal framework there, and the question is actually to use it. That's what this is about, isn't it?
It is, yes. And that demands political will. And that has to be very clear.
I want to turn to Gabriela, if I can, because another question which has come through from the audience is about raising the alarm and mobilizing funds and so on. On this issue, while the world is still dealing with the global pandemic, And I'm going to also turn to Valerie about this in a moment. But how do you, as an advocacy challenge, as a strategic advocacy challenge, what are your thoughts about taking that on?
Thank you very much. My immediate thought is is the work on the people's vaccine. So that we, and these days, today, we're hearing of lots of governments now considering rethinking the rules of what has been accepted as the intellectual property rights because of the special circumstances that we find ourselves in a pandemic. So we are using the possibility of liberating the vaccine IP so that more people can have access globally as is the right thing to do, and that we have been advocating together with many in alliance. So I think in the same way, to understand, we need to make the connections between these injustices clearer and understand it's a systemic big change that is required, along with the immediate support, of course, to the 30 million that require immediate help and the 5.5 billion that we're aiming for. We need to think about how we transform the system so that fair trade is not an unusual concept, but it's actually deep in the system, and that we know that resources are coming to all that need it, and that we don't have, of the 2/3 of the population of Africa that is small-hold farmers, that they are benefiting from the produce of their work, not only when it's in season, but also when the season or some climate shock is affecting them. So it's how we transform the system so that it cares for all, and it is possible. And today I think I have more hope than ever when we have been able to make these breakthroughs in terms of potentially making the vaccine globally available for all to help us solve COVID and therefore also these other big challenges that we're facing.
So if the pressure of the crisis from the pandemic is sort of forcing the advantages of this innovation, waiving the patent on vaccines, forcing that on us, maybe it can do the same in other critical questions that we face, which are in their own way just of exactly the same life-threatening dimensions. But Valerie, what's your thought about this question of how you maintain the advocacy for the increasing resources and the increasing effort which is needed on hunger and famine in the midst of this pandemic challenge?
Yeah, I mean, and it is a real challenge, and there is no question that national budgets and resources are hugely strained by the amount that has had to be poured into addressing the COVID pandemic, and in some ways is just in order to tread water. But I think there is an opportunity. The COVID shows how connected we all are and nations are, and of course that's an argument for further investment and sharing of vaccines, of the patents, et cetera. But not only disease, conflict also doesn't stop at the border. Mass migration also is a destabilizing factor beyond borders, and so we need to keep making clear that connectivity and the responsibility that we have to be supporting those furthest behind is not one that is limited to our own country. And the countries that are facing crises are more strained than ever with their tremendous debt burden as well. And there too is an opportunity to try to translate that debt burden into a means of reinvesting in these national systems, making them better and making them deliver better for those furthest behind. And and I do think though also that there is an onus on us as humanitarian agencies, as development partners, that we have a responsibility to use every dollar, every yen, every euro as efficiently and effectively as possible, make it count, use it simultaneously to meet urgent needs while making those investments that help reduce those needs over time. And that's a responsibility that we take very seriously.
And I will add in my tuppence worth on this, answering this question, or contributing to an answer, which is that there's been a lot of talk about building resilience. And you hear that word used in thinking about climate change and of course about natural disasters. We hear it used in thinking about the pandemic. And I think the reason why you hear the word used in these different contexts is because actually if you are resilient to one kind of challenge, you are at least building your resilience to another kind of challenge, whether that's conflict or in the neighboring region, or the effect of climate change, or a drastic turnabout in the terms of trade, which leave a community with gross livelihood insecurity. The more resilience there is to one thing, the more resilience there is to another. Muna, I want to pick up a question that has come in over Twitter. And it's about the relationship between short-term aid and local communities, and sustainability and something on a larger scale than just the local community. You've given some useful advice before. Can you give some more about how it's possible, if it's possible, to ensure that empowering local food communities on food security could have a long-standing impact at a national or a regional level?
There are many challenges. I mean, working in Yemen, the violence, there's just so many challenges. So I'm not saying that it's going to be easy, but I am saying that it's possible. We've seen it. I'll give you one example. For instance, we have a water project. It's called the Water for Peace project, where we encourage communities to work together to, first of all, we try to help them fix the water stations or build water wells, and things like that. And then we encourage education of girls. Now we have, for instance, a school which has 300 girls right now. And it's because of the water project. We gave them like an incentive of water to put those girls back into school. So this is a sustainable project now. And right now, and the water projects, we also have an agriculture project where we have greenhouses. And so this whole community, which was an armed conflict for 2 years in Al-Hamatain, has now completely transformed. They're working together. We were able to sign an agreement between, they just needed a third party to push them a little bit into, and also to give them an incentive and show them the way. And give them also some of the tools. So it is possible to have these kind of projects. And I've seen a lot of projects in Yemen which are even much better. For instance, the Social Fund for Development have been doing a great job. SMEPs have been doing a lot of great work. Yemen, these are organizations mainly led by the locals with international support. Also, partnering together with the private sector, a lot of impact, and you can see how they have transformed the local communities that they're working in from violent communities into more peaceful and sustainable and stabilized communities. So it is possible. I've seen it many times, and I think we should try to start to invest in the trust a bit more, because I think that's also blocking these kind of projects by the international community. There isn't enough trust, and I think this is the time, because the more and more we lose the access into these areas, the more we need the local actor to partner with.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I mean, those are really great examples, and I'm glad you have brought those to the surface. I'm afraid that we have lost Agnes Kalibata. I think we've lost the connection with her, or she had to leave. I'm not sure, but we continue with the four who are with me in a virtual sense as well as a real sense for another 10 minutes or so. And I wanted to come back to you, Janine, with a question which has come in actually off the platform that we're using. It's a question about prevention. How do we invest more in prevention? I suppose one could think about that in terms of famine prevention or conflict prevention or the relation, but how do we get that going? A long time ago, somebody said, a Norwegian politician it was, while I was living in Norway, that the reason politicians don't invest in conflict prevention is because there are no votes in preventing a war that might not have happened in a country far away that none of his voters had ever heard of. Right? So I think we've gone a little bit further than that in the prevention discussion in the last 20 plus years since I heard that. But sometimes I wonder how far we've gone. Can you see a way in which we can crack this nut?
Yes, I do, actually. And I think the answer to this is a lot of the goals in the Agenda 2030, because that is building, if we reach those goals, every goal is in a part a solution to this, because it builds strength, it builds stability. And we have talked about poverty and famine today, but also gender equality that also helps to build, and to have more equal societies, and to have more faith and in each other and into the political systems when they deliver. And we have a cooperation between people and decision makers that feels it's doing something. And that is, of course, building resilience in a larger sense. And then, of course, also the climate change, that we have to stop that, and we have to stop the biodiversity loss. And all these things build resilience. We have to have access to water. And so it's so interlinked. And that is why I say we have to work with all these things together. But then, of course, there's just, if you want to take peace and conflict and prevention in a smaller scale, of course, that is also education. And but also social trust, I think, of course, is very important there. But so there's, and it has to be on every level. Local, regional, national, and international.
I mean, I really like that idea that prevention becomes real when you're working on the intersection of these different risks that have been identified, which the SDGs provide, in a sense, the positive version of those risks. It's the same issues, but it's what to do about them. And I completely agree. I mean, Agenda 2030 is a map of human progress as it could be. We're coming into the last 5 minutes now of the conversation, and time is always the enemy with this kind of thing. Just as we're getting going, we have to jump out. But I want to ask each of you for 1 minute, and I will sort of cough rudely when that 1 minute is up, to tell me one takeaway that you have about something where we can move forward and make a difference. Perhaps based on this conversation, but perhaps coming more widely. I'll go in the order of Valerie, Gabriela, Mona, and back to you, Janine, for the last word before I have the last word. So, Valerie, what's your thought on this? 1 minute.
Well, look, you know, when the house is on fire, the priority is to put it out. And so we know how to respond to humanitarian crises, and we're facing a crisis of that proportion that requires us to step up. So the first priority is really to empower and enact those mechanisms that are there in order to reach people in need of humanitarian assistance at scale and deploy the resources now, not waiting until famine is upon us. But at the same time, to use every touch point with people, one, to better understand their needs and their vulnerabilities, and then to seize all available opportunities to invest in building their resilience to shocks, because as you highlighted, that will enable them to be able to withstand better not just the crisis that's upon them, but the other crises which are coming around the bend.
Valerie, thank you so much, and you were comfortably within the 1 minute mark. Gabriela, over to you.
Thank you. So I agree with what Valerie has said, and picking up on that resilience prevention issue, I think it's so important that we take this opportunity of the crisis that we're experiencing to also think about how we create responsive social protection mechanisms that really enable communities and people to have shock absorbers that allow them to prevent them falling into extreme hunger and famine. So there are system changes that we can now implement as we respond to the acute situation that is brought about at this moment with the pandemic, climate crisis, and of course, these conflicts that are rising in line with the previous problems. So how do we transform this opportunity into a way to ensure that we have seen a possibility of investing at large scale, as has happened, for example, for the US in its own country, but we can do it more widely and really avert these extreme famine and hunger situations.
Gabriela, thank you so much. And Mona, over to you. And you have a few seconds that you can steal from the previous two if you want to.
Oh, that's great. That's great, because I have three. Starvation as a crime. It needs to be prosecuted against humanity. To see the UN Resolution 2417 in action. Let's start with Yemen. Another point that I have is the lack of donor policy coherence, and I think that's something that we've been speaking about here between the human rights and development, a more multi-stakeholder collaboration. It's an important mechanism for addressing not only famine, but also COVID-19 and other issues. And I think that engaging private sector, communities, committees, representatives in all the programs, the start from the design of these programs, and channeling the women's voices is very important. We recently had a very good example in private sector cooperation with the UN, the UNDSA, and to combat COVID-19. It was an excellent initiative led by group. We need more of these kind of oriented kind of partnerships. I will just say that the failure to work together has led to gaps in coverage and also duplications of the emergency response. I also want to end that that we've seen so much money for bombs and bullets, but not enough money to really invest in the people. So I will end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mona. And Janine, your 1 minute.
Thank you. And I will take what the three have said here, because when the house is on fire, you have to put it out. That's the first thing. And of course, we have to see that the people starving have to have food and more security and peace. But we also know that right now we have several houses that are on fire, and we have to deal with all the crises simultaneously. And the only way we can do that is, of course, to do it together with partnerships on every level. And that we that are better off in all these crises have to be into helping and supporting the others on their demand and on the local areas and what is needed in the different contexts. But we have the famine, we have the COVID, we have the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, a democratic crisis that we haven't been talking so much, but that is of course a driver of conflict too. And so all this we have to work together and help each other.
Absolutely, and I think that this has been a tremendous conversation. I want to thank Agnes Kalibata, who's now left, Valerie Guarnieri from the World Food Programme, Gabriela Bucher from Oxfam, Mona Luqman from Yemen, and Janine Ericson in the studio with me, State Secretary for International Development here in Sweden. And if you were to do a wordle of this, you would come up, I think, looking big, would be words like access, short and long term, early action, leadership, coherence, resilience, political will, funding and resourcing, and partnerships. So this has been a great conversation, and if you have the appetite for it, you can come back in just 15 minutes to join me for a conversation on climate security, looking back and heading forward. 15 minutes time from now, the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development continuing. Thank you, everybody. Thank you all.
Thank you.